Hello and welcome to yet another programme in the series Reflections here on BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, a weekly spot in which I spend time in the company of a guest. Those guests, as you know, range from senior citizens to film stars and from survivors of disasters to those whose work in the field of entertainment has made them household names. I would suspect that my guest this week would not like to be classed as an entertainer, but in a way it has to be said that he would be hard-pressed to avoid it in one sense or another. For many years he presented the independent television news programme News at 1 until its replacement in late July, early August 1987, a date with which his retirement was to coincide. But there was much to take place before that, and to find out more, let's welcome my guest on this week's show, former television news presenter Leonard Parkin. Leonard, where and when were you born?
I was born in Yorkshire in 1929, so although I'm not an entertainer, I'm rapidly on the way to becoming a senior citizen.
What was your father's occupation?
He was a coal miner, and a very, very good one. When I was only 2, I think, he was running the biggest pit in Britain as a very young man, and was known throughout the South Yorkshire coalfield as a very, very good pitman.
Were there other children?
No, I was an only child. I don't know quite why I was an only child. I know my mother, she probably gave up all thoughts of having another one after having me.
Early school life, Leonard, as a nipper?
As a nipper, the local infant school, you know, one of those schools where you had to draw around your hand on the blackboard if you were a good boy. Then to a junior school, and then the county minor scholarship, which I won to a grammar school.
How did you manage to lose the accent, which in fact should so inevitably have been yours for life?
Not with any conscious effort, I think. We were never all that by gum at home. My mother always corrected me when I made mistakes, but I don't think I ever really consciously tried to lose the accent. But obviously, if you're in broadcasting, you have to somehow develop a kind of mid-Atlantic accent that isn't offensive to people. When I started in broadcasting, regional accents were almost unknown. Nowadays, anybody seems to be able to broadcast, and I don't think broadcasting's the better for it, frankly, when you hear some other people who do it.
If I've read my notes correctly, I get the impression that you admit very swiftly the debt that you owe to your parents. Now, I would therefore give you the opportunity to talk about them and how they were to steer you.
Yes, very much so. I quickly acknowledge that debt. Not because they steered me in any way, but because they encouraged me in any way. Anything I wanted to do, they would be willing to pass an opinion on. And if they felt it was the right thing to do, they would encourage me tremendously. And almost without my knowing it, if they felt it wasn't the thing that I ought to do, very tactfully they'd put the opposite point of view. They were very good parents without being excessively well educated, but they were educated in the ways of the world. My father was a very wise man, and it was a great sadness to me when he died when I was only 21 and he was 52. It was a colossal loss. But my mother was a tower of strength, and she didn't die until she was 74. So she had a long, long period after he died, in which, of course, we were in touch the whole time, and she used to come and stay with us frequently, and we with her.
Before we move away from your youth, as it were, formal education, where and what was the end result?
Well, I don't think I'm qualified to talk about the end result, but I had a very marvellous grammar school education. It was quite an old grammar school in Yorkshire at Hemsworth, in a mining area. It had a very young go-ahead headmaster who I think when I was at the school was only about 34 or 5. He was crazy about cricket, which was very much to my taste because so was I. And I had it was one of those schools where people would pat you on the shoulder and say, now come along, you must pass this examination. And you did. It was a great school to be at. I don't look back on school days as the best years of one's life, but I do look back on my period there as being a very lucky period for me.
When, then, and where did you begin your working life, and what were doing what?
Well, when I was at school, I used to do a weekly column for the local newspaper for 5 shillings a week, knocking on people's doors, getting the marriages, the deaths from the vicar, and going and knocking on people's doors and filling in the details. getting whist drive winners and so on, and learning a lot of the disciplines that one has to have in the newspaper business, getting people's names right, spelling them properly, getting the initials right. And I think from then on I decided that I wanted to be a journalist. And every move I made thereafter was to that end. And when I left school, I didn't go on to university. I took the advice of the then editor of the Yorkshire Post, a very famous editor called W.L. Andrews. And he was consulted, and he said, if I were you, I would get a job now. So I joined the local paper from which I did a column. And then after my national service, I joined another branch of that local paper company in a different town and went on from there.
I was in actual fact going to say, did national service intrude? You've brought it up. Talk to us about it.
Well, national service did intrude. Being an only child, it was...
a great intrusion.
I was called up. I'd never really been away from home very much. There I was, called up at 18, but only called up to go to a barracks in Pontefract, 7 miles away from where I lived. But there was the usual tears on the barrack gates as my parents dropped me there, and in I went. Well, my career in national service took an amusing course, because someone had told me that there were still army newspapers about, and if one wanted to join these army newspapers, you had to go into army education. So I put my name down to go into army education. And by the time I was 19 and a half, I was a captain. And I was demobbed as a captain. But I was always a bit ashamed at having had such an easy time in national service. So very soon afterwards, I joined the Territorial Army and went into the regiment I should have joined anyway. I went into the West Yorkshire Regiment and spent a number of years in the West Yorkshire Regiment Territorial Army. And when I finally left that, I had my own company and I was a major.
Back to work again then, Leonard.
Well, when I was demobbed, I went back to a little town in Yorkshire called Tadcaster, which is a very famous brewing town. And I joined the district office of the Wakefield Express series newspapers as a district reporter with a man who had been there since the year I was born, called Walter Druce, who I was very fond of and who taught me a lot. And I stayed there for a year, doing all the things that a young reporter does, from reviewing the local dramatic society to covering the local council, the local church meetings and so on, until such time as I felt able to apply for a job on a bigger paper, which is the logical way of doing things in journalism. I suppose it still is. And I got a job in Bradford on the Telegraph and Argus, which was the evening paper, and the Yorkshire Observer, which was the morning paper, the Bradford and District Newspaper Company. And this put me into the beginning of what I felt was the big time. It was a great place to be, because it must have been a vintage year, because an awful lot of the people who were there went on, just as I did, to do well in the various areas of journalism they chose. The chief political correspondent of the BBC, the night editor of the News of the World, and picture editor of the Daily Express. A lot of people did very well from there. It was a great training ground.
Take us, if you will, through the sequence which was to lead you into television, and let's go by way of the Yorkshire Observer, early salaries, the Crombie overcoat and radio work.
£5 9 and sixpence a week when I first joined the paper, and I had to live in digs away from home on that, and it was just about possible. My father died when I was in Bradford, so he couldn't help financially. In fact, I found myself helping my mother financially on a very small income. However, one managed, and one kept cheerful. The work at Bradford was tremendous. It was not only evening newspaper work, but it was the shift pattern meant that you worked for the daily newspaper as well, which I was very fond of. And there was a chief sub-editor there called Gilbert Yates on the morning paper, whom I used to see when I did late night duties there. And he was an old trooper, a real old trooper, a cavalryman from just after the First World War. And he used to swear like one as well, but what a good journalist. And he encouraged me tremendously. And he encouraged me to become agricultural correspondent of the Yorkshire Observer. I didn't know very much about farming, although I'd been brought up and spent a lot of time in my youth on farms. But I used to ring up from the Yellow Pages and say to the local farmers, "Hello, I'm the farming chap on the Yorkshire Observer. Can I come and see your farm?" And this developed into a weekly column called A Call at the Farm, which was widely advertised and I'm assured put some circulation on the paper up in the Yorkshire Dales. It gave me the opportunity to write. It made my name quite well known in that part of Yorkshire because it was bylined. And eventually, when I decided to move on, I was able to move to Leeds onto the Yorkshire Evening News and do more things there. I joined as a reporter, then I became a sub-editor, and I just managed to persuade the editor to start thinking of me in terms of a group employee rather than as a one-paper employee, and see if he could send me around the group, provincial newspapers, so that I could eventually come back to Leeds, knowing an awful lot, into a bigger and better job. And while that thought process was going on, I managed to get a job with the BBC.
I'm not going to let you get away without telling us about the overcoat.
You've actually been talking to someone. Well, the overcoat is one of those things that lives in the memory. It was one of those things rather like a small boy pressing his nose to the sweet shop window, because there used to be a tailor called O.S. Wayne in Bradford, just off Foster Square in the middle. Ozzy Wayne, we used to call him. And in the window were Crombie overcoats, you know, those huge, chunky, thick Crombie overcoats. And this was the days before a lot of central heating. And I used to stand looking at this dark grey overcoat in there, wondering whether I'd ever have enough money to buy one. And I never have, because I never had a Crombie overcoat.
March 1966, Ireland and the accident.
Oh, a traumatic time for me. I'd been over in March 1966 in Enniskillen, in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, covering the general election there. It was a good story because the Unionist candidate was a man called James Hamilton, who was the son of the Duke of Abercorn. So there was a lot of allegation of privilege and that kind of thing. It was a very good story. And my cameraman was a very famous cameraman called Slim Hewitt, and we did a very good story, I think. And James Hamilton offered to arrange some fishing for me. So I got in the car. There was Hewitt's tackle in the back, his camera gear and that sort of thing, but I raced off in the car with another colleague. And I got, I suppose, about 4 miles, was going round a bend. It had been snowing the night before, but there was steam coming off the roads. But unfortunately, on this bend, there must have been some black ice, because the car just went out of control and hit a thick tree stump head-on. And the engine came back and hit me, and I hit the windscreen. And I was quite badly damaged, cut about the face, and my hip smashed up rather badly. So they got me in an ambulance to Enniskillen Hospital, and when they discovered what was wrong, they booked a few seats in an aeroplane and put a stretcher in there and flew me to London Airport and then to hospital here in England, where I stayed for about 8 or 9 weeks, to be off work for 6 months. And in one's first year as a freelance, that wasn't very good news, believe me.
If there is a piece of history with which your name will be always to some extent linked, it must be the tragedy in Dallas in 1963. It was apparently a test of friendships as well as a test of your own ability to do your job in those appalling circumstances. Is it possible that you could précis the story for us, and most particularly, because I know you'd like to do, tell us about Jack Brooks?
Certainly, I'll come to Jack Brooks in a moment, because that's the test of friendship you were talking about. Obviously, this was the assassination of President Kennedy. I was BBC correspondent in Washington at that time. I'd been there only about 9 months. And it was a very ordinary kind of day that Friday. I remember closing down the circuit to London at 12:15 my time there. So I was having lunch with some Canadian correspondents in a place called the Speakeasy, a rather sleazy southern type of restaurant which we used to go to and drink dark beer and eat shrimp creole from time to time. And Jack Brooks, whom I'd worked with on the Telegraph and Argus in Bradford, and who had emigrated to Canada and had become correspondent of the Vancouver Sun, had stayed behind to finish telexing a feature to his office in Vancouver. when suddenly he heard a bell ring on his printer, his Associated Press or UPI printer, which gave the first flash of a rumour that shots had been heard in the vicinity of Kennedy's car. And like the good friend he obviously was, he picked up the telephone, rang the speakeasy, said, "You'd better get back. Something might be happening in Dallas." So we all leapt to our feet, thrust handfuls of dollar bills into the hands of a rather startled waitress, and ran out of the restaurant, with everyone open-mouthed, wondering why these four people were racing down 14th Street. Back to our offices in the National Press Building, where we all had our offices, and I burst in through my door. The phone was ringing as I got in, because London, on receiving this first flash, had put through a call to me, and within seconds I was dictating, not dictating, but just making up, ad-libbing, the first dispatch for Radio Newsreel. Because if you remember, all this happened at 12:32 Dallas time, which was 6:32 in London. Radio Newsreel was on the air at 7 o'clock. So between 12:32 we'd heard about it, or I'd heard about it, raced down 14th Street, up onto the 5th floor of the National Press Building, thought for 30 seconds or so about what to say, and did a dispatch. And from then on, I was in a constant state, a chronic state of broadcasting for about the next 20 hours, almost without stop.
Describe the atmosphere around you at that time.
One was a professional reporter launching into a story with all the vigour one could. When you're a correspondent on the ground, you don't often have to ask an enormous number of questions about what things mean, because you're supposed to know what things mean without necessarily asking a lot of questions. So, I was conscious of the enormity of what had happened. I had a very good idea of what happened next. So I was able to convey, I think, through my voice, the sense of shock and bewilderment that the Americans were feeling. Because to have Jack Kennedy cut off in his prime was a terrifying thing for them, because they'd hung so much hope onto him. The black population, through the civil rights movement, saw him as a saviour. I don't think he'd ever have got his civil rights legislation through Congress. Johnson did manage it, because Johnson was a very much more consummate politician than Kennedy was. But it was a terrifying shock. The Americans are used to having their presidents shot or shot at, so no one was very surprised that it had happened. But the sense of shock and bewilderment and tragedy that there was there will always stay with me. But I didn't realize it until the following day, because I was so submerged in the story as a story. But it was only the following day that I felt able to share it. And it was only a few days after that, after Oswald himself had been shot by Jack Ruby in Dallas, that I went down to Dallas and got to know how the people of Dallas were feeling about Kennedy, that they were full of shame. I went round one or two of the churches, and I went into one Baptist church and was recognized for an Englishman. And the minister actually asked me to go up into the pulpit and talk to them about what people in England felt about what had happened. And I did my best, and then they all crowded round the pulpit and sang "Nearer My God to Thee," and it was the most moving experience of my life. They were regarded in a way that very few presidential families had been regarded before them. This was Camelot. He'd surrounded himself with glamorous people. Washington was full of glamorous people and full of very talented, highly educated people. The Harvard and the Yale fraternities. This is one of the reasons, I think, that people were so shocked, because I think, in a way, they'd been looking to Kennedy to found a dynasty. There was Robert, perhaps, to come after him, and there was Teddy to come after him. They all had children, and who knows if these tragedies, successive tragedies, hadn't hit them. First the assassination of Jack Kennedy, then the assassination of Robert Kennedy, then the unfortunate things that have happened to Ted, which have umpired him out of the presidential race. They seem a family touched with tragedy, because Kennedy's elder brother, Bill, was killed in a bomber over the Channel during the war. He was the one who was tipped for the presidency. And I feel Jack Kennedy had to go into presidential politics in order to justify himself to his dead brother.
Is it possible to say whether or not your, in apostrophe commas, performances on that day helped your future career?
Oh, I think without a doubt. One of the things that happened, well, two things happened. The first was that I was more or less courted by Panorama to leave the staff of the BBC, as I had to eventually, to join Panorama, because they only employed freelancers as reporters. So I had to make that significant decision in 1965 and come back to England and join Panorama. But very much later, I got to know that another individual had been watching what I did out in the United States, the editor of ITN, Sir Geoffrey Cox, who had in mind, while I was there, actually, to say to me, would I transfer and stay in America for ITN? But he thought on reflection that that wouldn't have been quite ethical and didn't do it. I wish he had, in a way, but he didn't. But eventually, when in 1967, when News at 10 was beginning, he did in fact get in touch through one of his staff at ITN, an old friend of mine, who said, look, we've got this new half-hour news programme starting. We haven't got the muscle to do it that we'd like. Will you come and talk to Geoffrey? Which I did.
I think in actual fact the phraseology within the business is that you were approached.
I was approached, yes. I was approached, and I was very pleased to be approached, because I was going through, after that accident in Northern Ireland, I was off work for 6 months, and when I got back, my job in Panorama didn't exist anymore, and I don't blame them for that, but it didn't. And I started doing things I didn't really enjoy doing. I started working for a program called 24 Hours, which I had no respect for and didn't care for its type of journalism. And I went through a very unhappy period. And then out of the blue, one Saturday night when I was in a bath, the telephone rang, and I draped a towel around me and stood there dripping, while this voice from the past said, will you come and see Geoffrey Cox? So supply met demand, and that was the beginning of 20 extremely happy and productive years. It's amazing how this little bit of luck can transform one's life. I've always been a great believer in luck, you know. Have some luck. I think it happens to us all from time to time. We all have luck, and then you need the capacity to exploit it.
As so many people sat and watched you on News at 1 for so many years, you appeared to be so much a part of the home that one almost waited for you to ask if someone would pass you the salt at the lunch table. There has to have been gaffes, there has to have been mistakes, there has to have been embarrassments.
I don't recall any very embarrassing moments myself. Maybe other people will remember them rather better than me. You tend to have amnesia about your own mistakes. I can remember some of those of my colleagues, like one of them who talked about hooliganism on cross-flannel cherries, or who described the Duke of York as a very yucky young man when he was about to be married. But I do remember one occasion in the old First Report days when we used to do an enormous number of interviews when satellites weren't as readily available, pumping in pictures into the studios as they are now. And 3 people were wheeled into the studio while we were live on the air, and they were sat in 3 chairs, 2 on one side of me and 1 on the other. And I proceeded in each case to start an interview with them by addressing them by the wrong name. In every case, they said, I'm not him, I. Very embarrassing way to do it.
Have you maintained any sort of a contact with ITN since you finished?
Oh, yes, of course. I go there quite often. I still have an enormous number of friends there. And one of the things I did late last year was do a video for them on Ian Botham the man. ITN have gone into the video business. So we got an enormous amount of footage about Ian Botham's great moments out of the archives. And I went down to Worcester and interviewed him for 2.5 hours to link all this stuff together. And it made a very, very good video for the Christmas market. And that sort of thing I've done for them and will no doubt do again.
Do you socialise with the people that you used to work with, or indeed did you when you were working with them?
Oh, yes. One makes fairly steadfast friendships with a few people. We didn't live in each other's pockets. This is one of the products of working in London. people tend to funnel into London from long distances away. I live 30 miles north. Andrew Gardner, say, and Sandy Gall live 30, 40 miles south. So actually to meet at one another's homes is a round trip of, 150, 160 miles, so it doesn't happen very often. But certainly when one's in London, yes, you do socialise with each other.
Right, having come to the question of homes, tenuously, let's talk about this one. The Parkin home, the Parkin household. You're married?
Oh yes, I've been married an awful long time. I've got a son of 31.
Tell me about your wife.
We met on a tennis court in that little town of Tadcaster in Yorkshire a long, long time ago, and we got married in 1955 when I'd been a BBC reporter for about a year. We had Jeremy in 1957, and sadly, or perhaps not so sadly, he's our only child. I'm an only child just as he is.
What's he elected to do with his life? Is he going to follow you?
No, he's not following me. He never showed the slightest interest in journalism. He always wanted to be in the restaurant business, and he now has his own American bar and grill, an immensely profitable exercise not very far from here in Hertford, called Sloppy Joe's. It's the first of what he hopes is going to be a chain. He spends a lot of time with a pencil and notebook in America, picking up ideas and translating them here. He's in Germany at the moment, and he'll be no doubt picking up ideas there. That's his main enterprise, but his spare time activity at the moment is importing old E-type Jaguar cars from California and restoring them in the hopes of making his fortune selling them. But whether this will happen or not, I don't know. He's certainly got the cars, but they've yet to be restored and yet to be sold.
Hobbies?
Quite a lot. I've been fascinated by cricket all my life. I used to be a fairly good player. Of course, playing cricket had to stop when I smashed up my hip, but I've still kept in touch with the game. I go and see it quite a lot, and I used to collect books about it. I fish for trout a great deal. Love it. There's no other way of making peace with oneself than standing thigh deep in a small stream with the wildlife all around you. It's liquid Valium. I love fishing. That's a summer activity for me. I shoot in the winter. I enjoy that too, more the social element of it than the actual killing of birds. I don't really bother about large bags, but it's nice to be out with 8 or 9 friends in a shoot. We get to know each other quite well, and it's great fun. It's nice to be out in the open air at a different time of the year.
To bring the programme to its normal conclusion, I invite you to answer the standard final question. You are to have taken from you every memory you have bar one. Would you like to share with us the one which you would most especially and exclusively retain? It's
a very, very difficult thing to do because we are the sum of our memories, aren't we? But particularly when you get to getting towards 60, you begin to look back, and there's obviously more in the past than there is in the future. And we are a blend of all sorts of memories, good and bad. But I suppose the most vivid memory I've got is of that child, a few hours old, being held by his mother in a nursing home in York 31 years ago, because I had him born in York in the hopes that if he showed any talent for cricket, he'd be able to play for Yorkshire. And he had a shock of black hair, and his lips were moving as if he was hungry. And I think that at that time made me wonder about the meaning of life and its beauty and its mystery. And I think looking back, that's the most vivid memory and one I would like to take with me if I can only have one. You are by no means alone in your choice. This then has been Reflections. My thanks to my guest Leonard Parkin, but most especially, and as always, my thanks to you for listening. Until next week then, goodbye and
and do take care.